Well, welcome you guys. Good evening. My name's Day Johnson. I work with the National Park Service. Have any of you guys been to a national park? Mm-hmm. What national park have you been to?
I don't know the name of it. It's one in Monk's Corner. I think where the veteran thing's at.
No, so
like you mean like out of town, like Vegas?
No. National parks. You guys have 3 here. You guys have Fort Moultrie, Charles Pinckney, and Fort Sumter are all national parks.
We've been all those going here.
You've been all 3 of them?
Yeah, I've been all 3 too.
Okay, so that's who I work for, the National Park Service. And so I was asked here today, I'm the civil rights historian for the Southeast region of the National Park Service. And so I was asked to talk to you guys about oral history. Who knows what oral history is? Who's heard of it? So it is when you talk to someone who, I'm trying to say it for little kids because this is I'm trying to think of a way to say it for a younger audience. So it's when you talk to someone who's actually experienced the history, that grew up during the time period that you're looking at, right? And you're recording and collecting what they experienced, how they remember that event or that moment in history. So it's considered a primary resource. Do you guys talk about primary resources in school?
No, ma'am.
No? Who said yes? I heard somebody say yes. What's a primary resource?
Primary resource is like when the person writing or telling about it was there at the event.
They have first-hand knowledge of the event because either they participated in or they were an eyewitness. They saw it for themselves. So that's a great answer. Give them a round of applause. That was a great answer. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about oral history. Now you guys don't have to read. This is a very complex definition from the Smithsonian Institution Archives, but how they kind of define oral history. But what I said is a simple definition for you guys to grapple with. So why do you think we do oral history? Why do we do it? Why do we talk to people to learn how they experienced a moment in history or the past? To know about them?
Because times change.
Because times change, and what does that mean?
I don't know how to break that down, but 10 years from now, what's going on now won't be going on. 10 years, prior to 10 years from now, that's what's how we live.
So we have a record of what went on in the past because maybe some of the people 10 years from now won't remember what happened today, right? So right now they're doing interviews on, guess what? What's a big historical event that recently happened? A big happening in our own experience in the last few years. What did we all experience? COVID, right? So right now they're collecting oral histories on people's experiences with COVID. So sometime in the future when maybe we're all gone or we're older and we start to forget, we have a record of what that experience was like from people who experienced the pandemic firsthand. And so that's what oral history is doing. And it provides an insight into history that you wouldn't otherwise have, right? Because in our traditional narratives, is history made by everyone? When you read a history book, is it necessarily from, who usually is talked about in the history books? Do you see people in your family in the history books?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
What? Who do we usually see in the history books? What?
What's that?
Yeah,
In several books we
She said in history books, who do you mostly read about? Is it yourself? Is it other people?
Dr. King.
An old dead white man.
Right? The great men. We don't hear a lot about
Yeah, that's old dead white man.
dead white men, usually men prominent that were upper class, right? So you don't usually hear a lot about people who grew up in different social classes. You don't hear about women. You don't hear about children, right? You don't hear about people of color. And so oral history is a way as to how those people experiences those moments in time, so we get their perspective, right? Because history isn't just experienced by those men we hear about. History was experienced by everyone that was living during that time period. And their perspectives are just as important as all those other perspectives, because that's how we get a better, clearer picture of the past, right? By understanding everyone's perspective.
Right.
And sometimes, let's say we wrote a history of this event that's going on right now, and I wrote it from my perspective, how might my perspective be different from your perspective?
Who you asking?
Back there. How might my perspective be different? How might I tell the history of this event be different from the history that you tell of this event? I'm the presenter.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna write about, I gave this great presentation, the audience was filled, they were,
And we would have listened.
and you would do it from being in the audience, right? And so our perspectives are different. I might say, oh, you understood this, but I don't really know that you understood this. I know you were listening, you were here, and you might say, oh, I was listening to this event, and this is what mattered to me when I was listening. This is what I learned, right? So by putting together all of our perspectives about this event, we have a truer picture of just what went on here today. And that's what oral history allows us to do. It allows us to grasp those voices and get those voices and let them enter into the historical record, right?
Sorry, Carmen.
And so it creates a primary resource. It captures history in a person's own words, right? It's not somebody else, right, telling us what you said. We have your own words, a transcript or a video or recording of what you say. It helps us, as I say, recover history that would have otherwise been lost or not in the traditional historical records. It adds a personal dimension to the past, right? Because guess what? How we experience history is very personal, right? Usually when you think of history, what do you think about?
Back in the day, World War II, stuff like that.
Names and dates.
Oh yeah, the stuff is
Right?
Yeah.
This actually allows you to understand how people experience those events, right? If I was watching, let's say did an oral history on World War II from people who were in America and did not serve overseas, right? That's a perspective of the home front that we might not otherwise have, right? And so this allows us to give different perspectives of how different people experience historical moments, and that's important. It gives us a fuller picture. And it also can serve as a corrective, right? As I said, when somebody writes down the history, they're writing it from their perspective. If we have other perspectives, we get somehow closer, hopefully, to what actually happened, so we get a more accurate account of the past. And then, last but not least, history is important because it provides information that allows us to preserve and interpret these resources, right? If somebody doesn't know what happened there, let's say there's a home in that neighborhood, and everybody's like, well, is this home important? Should we preserve it? It's getting ready to be torn down. Maybe oral histories will give us clues to say, wow, this place was important. We need to preserve it. We shouldn't tear it down because this happened here or that happened here. Right. So it provides us a way to manage our resources and preserve our history, right? And that's very important, particularly to marginal voices, right? Marginalized voices, like women, like people of color, etc., people of social or economic class, because this is a way that gets their history out there, and so their voice can be heard, and then help to determine like the significance of a resource, so it's not lost, right? Because think about how many properties that have been important in Charleston are probably no longer here because people didn't value them, people didn't understand their history. So by creating these oral histories, we're allowing people to get these perspectives and understand their significance in other ways that might not make it into traditional accounts. So I'm gonna play you a video about why multiple perspectives are important. And this is from the perspective of the Little Battle of Bighorn, which was a Native American battle in Montana. And it shows you how having those different perspectives on what happened that day really create a new picture of what happened. And they actually, because they have a new perspective on that battle because of a Native American who recorded his oral history. So I'll play it, it's just a short clip. Let me see, please play. It was playing earlier. Oh, technology, everything was working before.
Oh,
did we lose internet while we were waiting? Oh.
Watch on YouTube.
I know, but if I can't connect to the, let me see if I can get to the internet. We watched it like 3 times before you guys came in. I think so. Yeah, I don't know if it timed out while we were waiting.
My view on all of this is that we desperately need to include that in our experiences where perspective, not just so that we can tell that side of the story, but that without that side of the story and without those
Oh, now it's going. True babies.
My view on all of this is that we desperately need to include Native American experiences and where possible Native American perspective, not just so that we can tell the Native American side of the story, but that without that side of the story and without those alternative and multiple perspectives, the American story is an impoverished tale of history. We've talked a lot about myth. I think if you're looking at the history of the West and you don't include Indians, that's a myth. An example that I like, and I've used it a lot, and I think it's a great illustration of that, is a story that comes from the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And it involves 2 people. It involves a American soldier, actually it was a German immigrant, and it involves a Cheyenne Indian. And the soldier was a guy called Charles Windle, and he finds himself in June of 1876 with George Armstrong Custer and Major Reno in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In that battle, the American command divides and attacks the village from different directions. Reno's command goes in first and is repulsed. They're driven back up onto the bluffs and pinned down by the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, and it looks like it's all over for them, and then suddenly the Indians all wheel away and go to the north end of the village where Custer is attacking, and they kill Custer. That night, the survivors of Reno's command who are suffering from thirst, they don't know what's happened to Custer, they know something horrible has happened, and they're expecting to be killed the next morning. The next morning, the Indians break camp and move off, and a relief column arrives, and Charles Windle survives. He records his experiences, and he remembers that night on that hill, and he says, and we listened to the drumming and the dancing down in the villages as the Indian, obviously is implying the Indian savages, conducted their war dances. Because in his imagination and his situation, this must be what was going on. A Cheyenne Indian by the name of Woodenloy, who was in that village, who participated in the fight, also in later life recorded what was going on. In his case, he told his story to someone who wrote it down. And Woodenloy tells us, yes, there was drumming and singing. And what was going on was the Cheyenne and Lakota women were mourning for the deaths of their husbands and brothers and sons during the battle. And I think that's a very important corrective. It's not to say that Charles Windle was distorting history or lying. I mean, I think his terror was very real. But getting that alternative perspective from the other side of the story, I think helps us to just adjust the focus of our historical lens a little bit and understand that this was, what happened there was a tragedy not just for the soldiers, the families of the soldiers that were killed, but also for the families of the Indians who won the battle. And I think those things are always important in history, to to have that kind of understanding and sympathy for all the people who are involved.
So do you see how two people recorded their oral histories and they had a very different perspective about what happened, right? What did the European say was happening when he heard the Native American music playing?
I want students to understand history as a collection.
So what did the European soldier think was happening when he heard the music? A war dance. They were celebrating that they had killed these American soldiers, right? And what did the Native Americans say that music meant? They were mourning their dead, right? It wasn't anything, they weren't celebrating the death of their enemies, they were mourning their own dead, right? So by having those both accounts, right, we understand what the American soldiers were feeling, but we also understand that what they perceived what was going on wasn't actually what in fact was going on. So those multiple perspectives expand our notions of history, and that's what oral history does for us. It allows us to hear those multiple perspectives, excuse me, and get a better understanding of history. So there's different types of oral histories, right? There's the life history oral history interview, and that's when you're focused on gathering biographical information about a person's life from childhood to adulthood. So you're usually following a chronology, right? You're asking them where they were born. You're just following them up through their adulthood, right, to the point they are now. Now this is good. What do you think life history interviews are good for? Oral histories are good for? Did you say something? What are they good for? If you're doing family history, right? They're good for family history, genealogical research, right? And sometimes they can be good to know about events, but they're really good for understanding the life of someone, the entire experience of someone from childhood to adulthood. The next type of interview is a topical history, and that's usually focused on a particular subject or event. So think of a historical subject or event you could focus a topical history on.
9/11.
9/11.
Civil War.
Civil War. Are we going to find too many people still alive that can tell us about the Civil War though? And that brings up another interesting point, right? Oral history is only a good methodology if what?
Someone's alive.
Somebody's alive to be able to tell you, to have that first-hand experience. What were you going to say? I saw your hand raised. You don't want to tell me?
We never went to a pandemic.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you. But those are kind of those events that are good for telling those events. And then the thematic is focused on a broad pattern or concept. So think about some broad patterns or concepts you can focus oral history around. School. Anybody else?
What do you think?
I see your hand raised back there. What were you going to say?
Me?
Yeah, you had your hand raised.
A doctor.
Like doctors, what it means to be a doctor, right? About doctors or medicine, right? The practice of medicine.
Gymnast teacher?
What?
Gymnast teacher?
Not a gymnast teacher, but maybe like sports. You can focus it around sports.
Sports, yeah, that's good.
A job?
Like, yeah, a certain type of job or industry. You can focus it on a concept like love, relationships, migration, immigration. The broad concepts and themes is what a thematic oral history focus on. And then you have the last type, which is a site or artifact specific. When you're focused on collecting information about a certain place or thing. So what is a place that you can collect oral history on? A school, right? A neighborhood. What? A mailbox?
No.
Well, you can. If it's an artifact in a museum and you want to know how this mailbox was used, where it came from. Yeah, artifact, what house it was in front of. It used to be in front of, so that's an artifact that you can research through oral history. How about you?
A book?
A book? If you wanted to, if you saw a book, you want to know who wrote it, where it came from, maybe what inspired it, like who had it, who owned it, what did they use it for? So that's an artifact that you can use. Oh, you guys have a lot of artifacts and sites. Oh, you have your hand raised again? What would you do an artifact or site-specific oral history on? What? Work? Oh, that's a good one. So you see there's different types of oral histories you can do. There's not one type, and that determines what kind of questions you'll ask, right? And so that's one of the things you have to think about, like what type of interview I want to do, what am I focused on, and then what types of questions would be best to answer what I'm trying to find out, right? So let's say you were doing a life history interview. What is a question you would ask?
Where were you born?
Where you were from, where you were born,
Where he lived?
where you lived,
When is your birthday?
when's your birthday? That's a good, but.
Brianna,
What?
you got something to say?
Say it.
What's the question you would ask?
What you have to add is important. You know what it says? You have one back there?
What state did you grow up in?
What?
What state did you grow up in?
What state,
Where
right?
you from, Major? You from?
What's your name? Do you have a nickname maybe? Did you go by other names? That might be a good question. But those are all good questions that you would ask in a life history interview. You guys did very good. Oh, I just want to make sure. I'm trying to make sure I stay on time because I can get out of, I can go off on tangents. So, before you begin your interview, right, you have to start to conduct research. How many of you guys have done research for school projects? You guys all have done research, that's good. So, if you're trying to find out about, let's say, name a topic you want to find out about. Art, right? What? Sorry, I can't hear you. Reading? Okay. So you would do all the background information. You try to do all this research about reading. When did people start to read? What books did they start to read? Do you have a question?
No, don't raise your hand.
So you would collect as much information as possible. And you might want to start looking at what people would be the best to answer those questions. So you would start identifying interviewees, people who you wanted to talk to. So if I wanted to talk about a school, the history of a school, who are some people I might identify to interview? Students? A class? The principal? Teachers?
The staff members that work for the principal.
The staff members, maybe the school secretary, maybe the janitor. If you wanted a full picture of the entire history of the school, you'd get those multiple perspectives, right? Each of those people would bring a different perspective to understanding the history of the school. So that's... Okay. And then you would conduct additional research specific to your interviewee, and then you would create a guide or an outline. So you'd start to come up with questions to ask people. And you would create a general one, right? But then you would, after you did some more research, you might want to have targeted questions directed to that specific person, right? If you found out about a person, like, let's say this person was homecoming queen, you might ask her questions about being homecoming queen because that's specific to her experience, and that would add a further dimension to that oral history. Boy, this 20 minutes goes by really fast. They said wrap up. So we didn't get to do a lot, but we kind of got through, but I'm just gonna kind of pick it up. Just some general things when you're doing these interviews. Just things to remember is when you finish your interview, always make sure you thank the interviewee for their time, right? They're being gracious enough to talk to you, make sure you thank them. You usually have to have them sign a release form that they're saying it's okay that I talked to you, it's okay for you to use my interview, because these interviews are going to go into the historic record. They're going to be archived. So you want to make sure that future researchers are able to use them, so you ask them to sign a release form. And you kind of let the interviewee know what is the project timeline so they know what to expect and when to hear back, when their interview might be published or different things like that. And then you leave contact information for the person so they can contact you and ask questions. And it's also a good idea when you finish transcribing the interview, when you finish duplicating it, to give them a copy for their own use as a gift, as just showing your further appreciation for their time and their effort towards the project. But always remember to be prepared, be respectful, sensitive, and understanding, because you might be asking some difficult questions for people. Allow the interviewee to do the talking, don't interrupt, don't talk over, and don't challenge. And try to keep the interviews kind of no more than an hour, because people get tired, people start to remember, and just be sensitive to how your interviewee, if they're fine, ask them, check in with them, say, hey, do you need a break? Do you want us to end? But before you end the interview, you always ask them, is there something I haven't asked you that you think I should know? Or is there anything else you would like to tell me? And sometimes it's in that moment that you get the best story of the whole interview, because it's not even one you had planned. So I hope you guys will go out and interview your grandparents, your parents, think about some things, practice this, and then hopefully you'll go out into your communities and get some really good stories. So thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you. And I don't know if they'll share with you, but I have some resources that you guys might be able to tap into, oral history guidance that kind of talks about this. You can watch some other interviewees to learn how to interview. And even there's a website for this project, the Black Businesses in Charleston project, and you can see some of the interviews that have already been done, and that might give you some tips on how to interview. So thank you.